For over 50 years, Burlington's legacy has been great deals on coats for all weather conditions. So before you're caught unprepared for the winter weather, head to Burlington for name brands, quality items, and surprising fits for every family member. Stock up on coats, sweaters, and accessories before the cold hits, so you can finally stop avoiding the elements and start living comfortably. Warm up at your nearest Burlington location less than 1 mile away. Burlington. Deals, brands, wow.
Hello and welcome to Outward, Slate's podcast about queer life, queer politics, and the little gay nuggets of history you didn't even know to ask about. I'm Christina Cauterucci, a senior writer at Slate, and this week I'm taking you back in time to an Italian villa just outside Florence. The Villa Gambaraya was built in the early 1600s, and after a few hundred years, by the turn of the 20th century, it was basically in a state of neglect until two lesbians came along and renovated it. A Romanian princess, Catherine Ghika, bought the villa in 1896 and moved in with her lover, an American artist named Florence Blood. And together, they built a spectacular garden on the grounds and turned it into a destination where they hosted parties and salons for women who lived in the area or would travel to be there. Today, the gardens of Gambaraya provide a little snapshot of a queer community from a century ago that most people don't know much about. And according to Kate Thomas, a professor of English literature and queer studies at Bryn Mawr College, in the design of those gardens, there's queer symbolism and meaning and openings for questions about lesbian life. Kate has gone really deep in her study of this estate. She gave a brilliant lecture at Harvard about the Villa Gambaraya a couple years ago. It was called Lesbian Arcadia, Desire and Design in the Fin de Siècle Garden. And I'm so pleased to have her as a guest this week on the show. We'll be back with Kate after a quick break. After a night with drinks, it's tough to bounce back the next day. But with ZBiotics, there's a surefire way to wake up feeling fresh after a night of drinking. ZBiotics pre-alcohol probiotic drink is the world's first genetically engineered probiotic. It was invented by PhD scientists to tackle rough mornings after drinking. Here's how it works. When you drink, alcohol gets converted into a toxic byproduct in the gut. It's this byproduct, not dehydration, that's to blame for your rough next day. Pre-alcohol produces an enzyme to break this byproduct down. Just remember to make ZBiotics your first drink of the night. Drink responsibly, and you'll feel your best tomorrow. ZBiotic is continuing to invent probiotics that will help with everyday challenges of modern living. Go to zbiotics.com/outward to learn more and get 15% off your first order when you use Outward at checkout. ZBiotics is backed with a 100% money-back guarantee. So if you're unsatisfied for any reason, they'll refund your money, no questions asked. Remember to head to zbiotics.com/outward and use the code OUTWARD at checkout for 15% off.
Streaming December 12th on Peacock. Paris Hilton and Nicole Richie are back.
That's hot. Loves it.
For a show-stopping reunion that will prove putting on an opera is anything but simple.
We're really good at this.
One thing's for sure, they won't be upstaged.
Good to have you back. Come on. We've got a show to do.
Paris and Nicole, The Encore, a 3-part reunion special, streaming December 12th, only on Peacock.
This episode is brought to you by AWS. Amazon Q Business is the new generative AI assistant from AWS. Many tasks can make business slow, like wading through mud. Help! Luckily, there's a faster, easier, less messy choice. Amazon Q can securely understand your business data to help you streamline tasks, like summarizing quarterly results or doing complex analyses in no time. Q got this. Learn what Amazon Q Business can do for you at aws.com/learn more.
We're back with Kate Thomas, a professor at Bryn Mawr College, here to enlighten me on the lesbian gardens of fin de siècle Florence. Kate, it's so great to meet you.
It's lovely to meet you too.
I just drew the barest sketch of what the Villa Gambaraya was under the stewardship of Princess Ghika and Florence Blood. Can you paint more of a detailed picture for our listeners of, what this place was, what they did with it, and, what was the significance of their renovation?
So first off, we have to understand that the hillsides around Florence were beautiful Renaissance villas that by the end of the 19th century had been really abandoned and neglected, and their former glory had just turned to rack and ruin. And what we see in Italy at this time is an interest taken in these kinds of ghosted, ruined places by colonies of women, artists, writers, gardeners, who are intent on forging their lives together and producing a sort of new rooted self. I really trace this back to the mid-century when an American actress called Charlotte Cushman starts a colony in Rome, not Florence, and she designs what she calls a set of jolly lady bachelors. And she invites other actresses, sculptors, artists of all kinds to come and essentially set up salon life with her in Rome. And I think this sort of sets the precedent. Italy is seen as a place of art, of possibility, of living freely with your lover. It's seen as a place of sensuousness, licentiousness, perhaps. And it sort of puts Italy on the map for Anglo-American lesbians. It's popular with the gay men too. We sort of know a little bit about that because of figures like Henry James, and we don't know so much, or we don't talk so much about the women who went there. But for them, it really was a sort of a place of refuge on the one hand, but also a place of play and experiment and partying, bacchanalian life that just didn't seem possible for various reasons in North America or in England. So you get these women coming over and trying to renovate estates and also establish themselves there, imagining for themselves the life they always wanted, and being able to write, to paint, to sculpt, to host incredible parties, and really take hold of a place. I mean, I think that the driving force for these women was that they really weren't allowed estate. And by estate, I mean, they're not allowed, actual sort of generational wealth in many cases. They're not allowed to have political or cultural significance. They can only imagine gaining social status through marriage. So women are just not really able to have a place as we might define it really deeply. And I think what Italy offered at the time was that place, that sense of place, that ability to not necessarily inherit beautiful Renaissance estate, but to go and find one and to salvage one and to put it back together. I mean, it's this very queer impulse, it seems to me, of I'm not given anything, so I'll go and find what's abandoned, but I can see it's beautiful and I will know how to restore it and reanimate it. They're picking up the pieces. Educate themselves. They steep themselves in the history of the place, and then they present themselves as sort of uniquely equipped to understand it and to be the new inhabitants of it. So they're really picking up pieces. They're seeing ghosts. They write about that quite literally. We've got some of them like Vernon Lee. She imagines herself as able to see the ghosts of the 18th century. They even sort of dress a little bit like ghosts. So Princess Ghika, who buys the Gambaraya, she dresses all in white and she wafts around her estate in the early hours of the morning and late at night. And if people catch a glimpse of her, they think that, she's a specter. So they're really resonating with those kinds of histories, and then they're making the place real again.
So these people, many of these women, and I'm thinking of the expat community in Paris too, which I think a lot of us know more about, the sort of Gertrude Stein, Natalie Barney cohort. Mm. These were people who were wealthy in their own right. Is that right? But because they couldn't inherit land, is there a sense in which, because these villas were dilapidated, they were a little cheaper maybe for them to procure?
Absolutely. Yeah, there's definitely a sort of hard, cold cash story to be told, which is to say that if you are probably a middle class family, but your means have become a little strained, it was cheaper to live in Europe and quite a lot cheaper to live in Italy. So you certainly get the sense that most of these women who are settling down there, not all, but most of them, are perhaps experiencing a little genteel slide in the family finances, and they can preserve their class status and they can preserve their cultural status by going and living somewhere else. And if you think about a figure like Vita Sackville-West, very wealthy family, extremely high Tory family. And that's something that Vita maintains across her life, but she loses her family estate. She loses the exquisite, huge, house at Knoll because she's female and she can't inherit. And so when Virginia Woolf writes her time traveling, fantastical, sort of novel, sort of love letter called Orlando, it's really this means that Virginia has to give Vita back her estate. She includes photographs of Vita sitting on fences at Knoll. And it's really about what if you could imagine changing sex, being immortal, being able to stay where you want to stay, which Vita doesn't get to have. She does go and reinvent it, in her case, at Sissinghurst Castle, where she has her famous White Garden. And lots of these other women that you mentioned, like Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas, they can do it in Paris too, but they're also traveling to Italy. They visit the Gambaraya. They actually even get engaged on the hillside overlooking the Gambaraya. So it's very much this, you're right, this sort of sense of those who are familiar with the European tour and identifying themselves with all things antique and high culture, and they're looking for ways to maintain those connections. So we definitely are seeing that kind of socioeconomic class in these histories, but not entirely, as I say. When Charlotte Cushman comes over to Rome earlier in the century, she brings a couple of sculptors with her who she supports financially and who don't have that kind of background. So there's a way in which I always think about queer culture as enabling sort of cross-class relationships, which maybe we see more with the men, but there's some of that we get to see in Italy too.
I love the idea of a colony of lady bachelors. Very few people know, but lady bachelor is actually what the L stands for in LGBTQ. When Princess Ghika and Florence Blood, embark on this renovation, what influences are they drawing from, and how do they kind of develop the sense of, what they want to create in this place that's going to be fully theirs?
I see it as them designing their garden and their villa around the sense of an Arcadia. And an Arcadia is this really interesting thing. On the one hand, you can point to a map of Greece and there is a place called Arcadia, but basically it's an imaginary place. It's like a utopia, which means nowhere place. But an Arcadia is an imaginary place that's been varnished and seeded over the years by sort of a literary and cultural imperative towards living in harmony with nature. So bringing human life or social life and natural life together as one. So rather than Princess Ghika and Florence Blood seeking to do a sort of, Laura Ashley-like perfect parody or mimicry of the past, I think they see themselves as much more trying to reanimate the past. So on the one hand, they are putting things back in place that had just been overgrown. And on the other hand, they're importing their own designs. So Princess Ghika, we know for sure, because of course the record is extremely spotty and broken. We don't know much, and perhaps they wanted it this way. But we do know that Princess Ghika designed what was called a water parterre. So a portion of the garden that's centered around a water feature. And it has a kind of axis that divides it. It's very, very formal in one sense. And then when you get down on your hands and knees and look, it has all this intricate mosaic work around it. And so we know that she designed that. And that was not original. This was her own whimsy and her own expression of herself. And there are lots of maybe apocryphal, maybe not stories about parties in which she wafted down from an upstairs bedroom through a secret spiral staircase, sort of flying buttress, and appeared magically, some say nakedly, except wearing 3 rubies in strategic places.
Can't imagine what those places would be and how you would put a ruby there.
Yes, definitely the forehead, I think. Yeah. And, appearing at her water feature and moving between her guests. And for me, whether these stories are true or not, I think it's an expression of how they saw themselves as modern day nymphs or naiads. They're populating their hillsides with the mythical figures that inspired them. Many Renaissance villa had a grotto, for example, and the Villa Gambaria is no exception. It had a garden that was also called a nymphaeum, and stuck into the walls of this walled garden were pieces of coral and fossilized sponge and all these intricate little sea creatures. And for me, it's about them imagining a different world, and in that case, a sort of subaquatic world or a subterranean world where they've dug up these antique forms and they have identified with them, they have decorated with them, and they're definitely textures that invite you to sort of run your fingers along them.
So I know some of these things, like the shells even, have some queer significance. What about these little details that they've included in their renovation strike you as particularly significantly, queer or lesbian?
Well, one of the features of the house is that it is oriented differently from all the other villas in the area. And it's a sort of cool reminder that, we often talk about sexual orientation without really thinking about it. And so I think they didn't build the villa, and they didn't change its axis, but they did choose it. And so there is expression and choice, right? And I think they were probably attracted to this villa being off center. We know that Princess Ghika was quite socially reticent. She sort of cultivated an image of herself as a recluse. And it is true that this is not a villa that opens itself to guests easily. It's difficult to find the door. And that's always architecturally really interesting, right? Who's being invited in? It's also a villa where you can see through it. When you do get inside, there's an internal courtyard, and you can open the doors to these courtyard and you can see all the way through the villa. And so it strikes me that it's got this wonderful play with closeting, in the sense that it's hard to find it. It's hard to get in, but once you're in there, it's extremely permeable. It's extreme. You have a lot of mobility, and it gives you all these different prospects and vistas. And it seems to me that this was something that this area and this landscape afforded women who, again, were usually expected to be closeted by virtue of their gender alone, in the sense of domestic, being, denizens of a parlor, but not out planting cypress or looking across mountains. And so I think that's definitely one feature, the architectural orientation of the place. I think also the fact that they are looking out over a city, but they're not part of it. They're away from it. They're in their hillsides, means that they get to imagine themselves as having this rustic, pastoral, bacchanalian life that isn't even constrained by urban or social expectations for them. One of the neighbors of the Princess Ghika, a writer called Vernon Lee, and when she's looking for a villa in the area, she's really, really particular about how far it is back from the road and who can see in and who cannot see in. And she really has that sort of imperative towards making her own little private refuge. And I think it's about sinking into the hillsides. I mean, Vernon Lee's given name was Violet Paget, and she switches it out, obviously, for the more androgynous name. But Vernon also means the place of trees. It means the location of trees. And I think all of these women in this area are rooting themselves. They're planting themselves into these hillsides in an imaginative but also kind of stubborn way.
We're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back.
Time to move? Skip the hassles of selling during the holiday season and sell your home directly to Open Door. Request an all-cash offer in minutes, close, and get paid in days. You can even pick your close date so you can move after New Year's. Start your move at opendoor.com or download the Open Door app. Open Door is represented by Open Door Brokerage Inc., license 02061130 in California, and Open Door Brokerage LLC in its other markets. Terms and conditions apply.
How about some fresh out of the oven gingerbread, bright snowdrop, fresh Iowa pine, and cool peppermint to put you in the holiday cleaning spirit? Made with goodness, not a lot of nonsense. Mrs. Meyer's. See what good can grow. Visit mrsmeyers.com today.
We're back with Kate Thomas talking about lesbian villas and the lesbian landscape. Why do you think, landscape development, landscape architecture, and sexuality or lesbianism should be discussed together? What's the connection there for you?
That's a great question, because it's not discussed together enough. I work in queer studies. I'm an academic in an English department, as you said, and we're used to sort of putting queer studies and queer history in partnership, hand in hand with lots of other fields. But landscape architecture has been slow to do that. And not that there's nobody out there doing it. There are scholars who are working on it. But it's interesting to me that we tend to think about landscapes as backdrops or scenery and as not very animate things. But landscapes can be desired. We know that. We know that we like to take ourselves to certain views and look out. And I would argue that you can also think of landscapes as themselves being desiring. There are concepts in landscape architecture that really are so ready to be connected to queer studies. Landscape architects, for example, talk about, those little paths that we make when we go off the path because there's a quicker route or something we want to see. And we do it so often that we make a little, muddy goat path through a lawn or something. Well, those are called desire paths in landscape architecture. So that's an acknowledgement that actually desire does have a lot to do with the botanical and the agrarian, and climate even. Mm-hmm. So we should be talking about the two things together. And if you look up the word sexuality in the Oxford English Dictionary, the first 6 entries are all about plant life.
That's so funny. I also think about the long history of parks and beaches as particularly gay male cruising spaces. And I know a lot of that is based on necessity and the need for, public spaces, because private spaces that welcomed the public were not always places where gay men could find each other. But I also think there's something attractive about being among nature and being in a free and open space like that that's drawn people throughout time.
I absolutely agree. I mean, we talk about human nature. We need to think about it in nature. And you can go to histories such as, we all talk about Stonewall, but, at the exact time that Stonewall is happening, there was oppression of queer community happening in a place called Kew Gardens in Queens, where they were cutting down trees because they were worried about men cruising. Also, wonderful histories, of course, of Hampstead Heath in London as cruising grounds. And I'm thinking about an artist like Derek Jarman, who writes so expressively about the importance of, as you say, being in nature and being free and being sensuous and being at one both with other men in that case, but also at the same time with the landscape itself. We do think about how landscape comes first for some people. I mean, you can even go to, Elizabeth Bennet in Pride and Prejudice. She falls in love with Pemberley before she falls in love with Darcy. And maybe it remains the stronger passion. And certainly the lesbians I'm looking at, they write with such lush lyrical prose about falling in love with Italy and trembling and feeling ecstasy when they see the landscape. So on the one hand, yes, their lesbian life is with other women, but is it similarly, equivalently with the landscape itself? I think that's a really, really provocative idea.
Do you see a connection between what these women outside Florence were doing and what the lesbian land movement was doing in 70s, 80s, where women would sort of buy a piece of rural land and kind of create everything for themselves, an enclosed community where they were hoping to be fully self-sufficient. And, that dream didn't really come to fruition. But is there a connection there for you?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, there's nothing new here, right? I mean, women have tried this again and again. And I agree that the sort of Arcadian impulses of the late 19th century map onto the utopian impulses of the 60s, fueled by, social rights movements of the time. And I think people are constantly trying to take themselves to a place where life feels possible, and where you can be together. And so I think it's really similar. It's probably different in terms of the social, economic, and racial dynamics, but it's been done before. And in my project, I actually look at, there are a couple of cousins at the end of the 18th, early 19th century in England called Mary and Jane Parmenter, and they build an octagonal house that they call à la ronde, and they try to set up their will so that they can bequeath it only to what they call unmarried kinswomen. It works, I think, for a generation or two, and then it fails. And so that, that history is lost to us too. But that's a century before Princess Ghika and Florence blood, and they designed and built it after visiting Italy. So they went on their tour of Italy, and they were inspired by all these chapels and villas that they saw in Italy. And they came back to Devon, and they're like, "Let's do it here. Let's have a little Italy here." So they built an octagonal house that they have a gallery inside, upstairs. It's called the Shell Gallery, and pressed into the walls all these shells that they had collected during their travels, and also bird wings on the ceiling. I highly recommend a visit to it. It's now owned by the National Trust in the UK, and so anybody can visit, and it's just an extraordinary, audacious place.
And isn't it also true that shell collecting was like a pastime that it was appropriate for women to do together or something? It made me think of the movie Ammonite.
Yes.
Where they're, looking for fossils, and, your hands brush one another while you're reaching for the same fossil or something like that.
That's exactly it. That you're like, you get to like, oh, I have to go on a walk with my friend, and, have our hands in each other's pockets. Great.
Perfect. What you're engaging in your study of this estate is, to me, it's not just historical analysis, but it's almost like art criticism in a way, informed by this history, but also finding meaning kind of outside of what the creators might have intended. It probably wasn't that Catherine Ghika and Florence Blood were like, yes, this is like the lesbian choice that I'm making in this garden. But what do we gain from kind of making those connections and finding new meaning in them, 100 years later?
I think it opens us up to see the possibilities of making meaning out of the material, being able to look at a design or look at a planting of a tree or think about a texture on a wall, and to say, what's the erotics here, or what is the aesthetics here? We're not going to find our queer histories where we want to find them. So we don't belong in certain kinds of texts. We don't show up in marriage registers, or the chronicles are not written about us often. And you can find them, I think, in the crevices in a grotto. You can find them in the slant of light in a particular hillside. And so I think it asks us to be imaginative. I think it asks us to be alive to feeling, to sensation in certain places, and to say, those are stories too. Those hold histories too.
Yeah. One thing that you've said that I've been thinking a lot about is you've said that the closet is to gay men as the garden is to lesbians. Can you flesh out that analogy for me?
Yes. I think that the garden can be enclosed. It can be a walled garden. Mm-hmm. There's a history of a form called the hortus conclusus, the closed garden, that was imagined to be a place for women. And the question for me is, does being closed in always mean that life isn't possible? What if you're closed into your walled garden and that's exactly where you want to be, and exactly where you want to be is with only women? So that we've done a lot of theorizing, queer scholars have done a lot of theorizing about the closet as this sort of place of freedom and fear. Are you forced into the closet? Are you going to be forced out of the closet? Can you choose when you go in and out? And it's obviously a very powerful paradigm for many of us. But women have a really different genealogy with relationship to the domestic, with spaces, certainly with the relationship between public and private. We just don't have the same kind of orientation or history to it. So I think the garden is just very interesting as a place where you've been allowed to gather often. You know, Virginia Woolf was taken by her very stern father and taught all the Latin names of plants. So she has this kind of, got a kind of horticulturalist but botanical education that's considered completely appropriate for girls. My dear friend Michael Bronski has written beautifully about the art of Kate Grinaway, which is often seen as this Victorian, flowery, twee, totally safe, completely chaste little sort of world. And he's like, what if it's early lesbian porn? Maybe this kind of pastoral scene with like muslin dresses is actually, really hot. So I think it's saying, what goes on in that garden? Let's ask what it's like to be in a garden with a bunch of women, even if you've been made to be there,
Yeah, it's like, creating the world that you want within the bounds of what you have access to.
Right. Yeah, that's right. And seeing yourself as sort of contiguous with plant life. I mean, not seeing yourself as discrete and only and in your little box, but actually the tendrils of your world reach out.
Well, I think that's all the time we have. I could talk about this forever, but listeners, you can watch Kate Thomas's lecture, Lesbian Arcadia, Desire and Design in the Fin de Siècle Garden on YouTube. Kate, thank you so much for being here.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
That's it for our show today, but there's always more Outward over in the Slate Plus feed. This week, Kate Thomas will stick around to help us update the gay agenda. If you're not already a subscriber, remember, by joining Slate Plus, you'll get ad-free podcasts, extra segments on all our shows, and you'll never hit a paywall on the Slate site. Subscribe now on Apple Podcasts by clicking Try Free at the top of the Outward show page. Or visit slate.com/Outward Plus to get access wherever you listen. We're always looking for your feedback and your topic ideas. You can email us at outwardpodcast@slate.com. Our show is produced by the jolly Lady Bachelor, Palace Shaw. If you like Outward, please subscribe in your podcast app, tell your friends about it, and rate and review us so other people can find it. Stay gay, everyone. See you next week.